Schwarzenberg fancies having a go at Napoleon himself. And essentially there's a battle at Dresden where the Austrians are thoroughly defeated by Napoleon himself. So they get the lesson pretty quickly that you shouldn't take him on. In fact, Alexander himself arrives on the first day and says, I don't like the plan. He says to Schwarzenberg, we're not doing any of that. And everybody agrees that Schwarzenberg's plan was really bad because it involved a series of sectional attacks which basically would have sort of broken up the formation, and of course Napoleon would have eaten that for breakfast. There's no question about that.
Prussia is nowhere, it's probably wiped off a map, and you'll have this weird sort of multi-national entity. It's a bit like sort of Charlemagne's empire,
like a Holy Roman Empire
under a Bonaparte, Habsburg dynastic kind of family. Now, can such an entity survive a rise of nationalism, which is got its own dynamic behind it? Are Germans, Italians going to kind of, throughout the 19th century, are they going to sort of put up being part of this huge sort of multinational entity?
Blucher comes in inconveniently. If Blucher hadn't come in, he'd have had Schwarzenberg where he wanted him and pushed him back over the mountains again. That's where he wins. If he manages to take out the Austrians first and then turns around and says, well, okay, guys, who's next?
It's the 16th of October, 1813, and one of the largest land battles in history is about to begin. Often called the Battle of the Nations, over the course of 3 days, more than 500,000 men descended on Leipzig for the culmination of Napoleon's campaign in Germany. He and his Grande Armée took on the Sixth Coalition, led by von Blücher and Tsar Alexander I of Russia, yet the result was disastrous. Napoleon's Saxony and Württemberg allies switched sides 2 days in, forcing the French general into a tactical retreat across the Elster River. There was a French plan to blow up the bridge and prevent the opposition from following, yet this exploded too early, leaving thousands of their own men trapped. The result ended Napoleon's grip on the east of the Rhine and saw him exiled to Elba mere months later. Yet today, we imagine a different outcome. I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Battle of Leipzig, a 3-day assault that was the largest Europe had ever seen until the First World War. It was a humbling for Napoleon Bonaparte, but with a few key changes, could we have seen a very different version of history? These are, of course, questions for our experts. And joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And returning to the channel once again is Dr. Michael Rowe, reader in European history at King's College London. Welcome to you both. Now, sadly, Darryl Morris can't be with us today, but don't worry, he'll be back very soon. In the meantime, while I'm normally in the producer chair for History Undone, today I'll be here with you in the studio. Now, before we discuss the German campaign and the battle itself, let's talk about what is going on in Europe. In front of us, we've got a map of Europe in 1812. And of course, in 1812, Napoleon failed to invade Russia over here. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. Just talk us through where we are between the failed invasion of Russia and then where we get to Leipzig in October 1813.
Well, thank you. Yes, this map shows Napoleon's empire at its greatest extent. This is on the eve of a Russian campaign of 1812. It's an empire, if you include everything within that sort of red line, of about 80 million. It's a bit flattering, of course, to Napoleon in that a lot of Spain here isn't under French control. Over the summer of 1812, Napoleon, of course, famously launches his invasion of Russia. 600,000 troops, 680,000 troops, the largest offensive really in history up to that point.
Yeah, that's kind of unprecedented for this sort of time period.
It is unprecedented, and of course it becomes a disaster. Napoleon blames it on the weather. It isn't entirely the weather's fault. There's also some very clever work by the Russian military leadership. They sacrifice Moscow, the Russians. Napoleon hangs on too long. He then retreats. The retreat turns into a disaster, and most of that fantastic international army doesn't make it out of Russia.
Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you on History Undone. As Michael says, if it is such a disaster, how is Napoleon kind of able to rebuild that Grande Armée for another assault, just a year later?
Well, you've got a bit of a political problem now, because not only has he failed in Russia, you've got the Russians coming west as well now. So that's putting pressure on the states of Germany, particularly Prussia, Saxony. The Bavarians are saying, well, hang on, how far are the Russians going to come, having just sort of stopped Napoleon? Meanwhile, Napoleon goes back to France and says, look, we're in mortal danger. The Russians are coming. We've got to consolidate what's going on in Germany. If we don't do that, the Austrians are going to get restive, and the whole thing is going to fall apart, this whole continental system that he's put together. So the idea basically is to attack one of the members of the coalition, and that is Prussia. He thinks by doing that Austria will stay neutral, and it may well keep the Russians back. So he's thinking in terms of a strategy here, how he's going to do that. The problem for Napoleon is, while he's building this army, and we've got to say, France has been bled dry up to this point. So quite a lot of this army is teenagers, raw recruits, people he hasn't used before, people who have come back in basically because of the fame and prestige of Napoleon. And of course, la gloire, the glory of France is very important here. But at the time, France is suffering economically. They're being blockaded by the British. There's all sorts of internal tensions. There's talk of, a revolt in the south and things like that. So quite a few pressures. But the critical thing that happens in February 1813 is the Prussians and the Russians have a secret agreement that they are going to actually take on Napoleon. And they start talking about who can we actually break off from what is this Confederation of the Rhine, which is essentially Napoleon's way of controlling quite a lot of the states that he has allegiance from: Saxony, Bavaria, Württemberg, Westphalia, places like that. And so they start working on that basis. And as we get into 1813, Napoleon says, right, we're going to have to deal with this. We've got to consolidate our power in Germany. As I said, keep Austria to one side, hopefully keep them neutral. After all, it is my father-in-law actually running Austria at the time. Meanwhile, I've got to keep an eye on Spain, because my brother's not doing very well against Wellington and the Spanish and the Portuguese. But if we go for Prussia, knock them out, then we've got a chance.
And Leipzig is right here on the map. I don't want to jump ahead too much, because obviously we will get into the battle. That inexperience, Michael, that Chris talks about the troops, does that come back to bite Napoleon?
It does indeed. These are troops who are in their sort of about 19, 20. Physically, they're not, entirely mature. People mature slightly later in this period than today, because of things like diet. The campaign, as we'll see in 1813, does require a lot of marching. It's a very mobile campaign, and young raw recruits who have probably loosed off about 6 rounds of their musket as part of their training, no more than that. They're not going to be very good at sustaining sort of campaign fatigues. What I would say, mind you, is that going for Napoleon is a fact that the Russians themselves have suffered huge losses in 1812. It might be 600,000 on the French side, but it's probably close to 400,000 on the Russian side. So they're starting from a fairly low point at the beginning of 1813 as well.
So we're going to get into the German campaign in just a second, Chris. But just picking up on that, so what sort of place are sort of both sides in, and the personalities here leading them?
So leading on from the sort of secret pact, diplomacy starts to put together what is known as the Sixth Coalition. There are a series of coalitions against Napoleon, and this one involves Britain, Spain, Portugal. They bring in Austria, but also the Kingdom of Sweden. Now, there's an interesting personality here, because the Crown Prince, Charles John, is actually an ex-Marshal of France called Bernadotte. So he's brought into this.
Additional skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's got an insight into the way. Also, of course, that insight means he's a bit wary of him as well. That's the other thing. So you've got that in there. You've got there are 4 main armies that contribute to this campaign. There's the army of Bohemia, and that's predominantly the Austrians, but quite a lot of Russians in that as well. You've got the Army of the North, which is basically North German states and also Swedes, and again, a lot of multinationals. You've got the Army of Silesia, as it's called, predominantly represented by Blücher, who becomes famous later, of course, Napoleon, when Napoleon is at Waterloo. And then finally, you've got the Army of Poland, and that basically gets put together much later. So you've got 4 big armies converging now on what is the threat, essentially, to Prussia. And we've got to understand that Napoleon is trying to break apart this as it is forming, but also going for Berlin. He really is targeted on going for Berlin, knocking Prussia out, and in the meantime saying to the others, you really shouldn't bother here because you're not going to beat me.
Well, he's going for Berlin. It seems apt then that we move on. That's some of the background that was happening at the time. Now let's get into the German campaign itself. Now, it's important to remember the Battle of Leipzig does not happen in isolation. It was part of a campaign. And in front of us, we have the Napoleon's German campaign, kind of as it was in sort of October, in autumn. We'll be talking about Leipzig here in just a second. We started before by saying, why he's trying to get to Berlin, Napoleon. Michael, why does he not get there? How do we get to this point?
Well, I suppose we do need to go back to the beginning of 1813, and the campaign in Germany is really in 2 parts, with a truce over June and July. And in the first half, the odds against Napoleon are much more favourable to Napoleon. He's only facing Prussia and Russia. So this large force here, this is a map of the 2nd of October, this large force under Schwarzenberg, mainly Austrian troops, we can forget about that for the first half of 1813. It doesn't exist. He's confronting the Prussians and the Russians only. Mind you, most of the fighting actually does take place in Saxony, which is a sort of key theatre of operations. It's to the north here of the Erzgebirge, the Alps Mountains, and on the other side you've got the Austrian Empire. And strategically it's important. You've got the Elba River, which leads down to Hamburg, which briefly actually does fall into Allied hands, but then is reoccupied by the French before that truce. Berlin is a target, but I think Napoleon quite wisely sees Saxony as the main theatre of operations. Saxony is an ally of a faithful ally of Napoleon, and what you really want to do is avoid any kind of linking up of Austria with the other coalitions. Yes. So if you intersect yourself here, that makes political sense.
I've been doing History Undone with you for a number of years now, Chris. Things that always crop up are the weather and the terrain. Right. We might not have the weather in this one, but we've certainly got the terrain.
Well, in some ways, Fergus, you do have the weather because we're talking about this taking place in October.
Yeah.
So this is well after the harvest has been taken in, what is left of it, because if you think about these campaigns that occur from August right through to October, the countryside has been stripped bare. Not just for the troops, but also for the populations. The other thing worth bearing in mind is that Napoleon's lost a lot of men in Russia. He's also lost a lot of horses. So he's light on cavalry, and that has 2 effects. One is the shock action of cavalry in battle obviously is reduced, but also, of course, his scouting operations are diminished. And if you haven't got your cavalry out looking for the enemy, you're going to lose track of all these armies that are marching in this very complex area here.
Can we talk about, because the 6th Coalition have a plan, don't they? The Trachenberg plan. And I think even on this map, you can kind of already see it working.
Yes, so this is a plan which is put together over the late spring, early summer, during that truce period. The people who are credited with it typically are Bernadotte, who obviously has a degree of inside information when it comes to how Napoleon operates, and also Radetzky, who is the chief of staff of Schwarzenberg. So he's an Austrian general with an interesting career both behind and ahead of him. And the idea is to make use of your numerical superiority, but countering Napoleon's obvious sort of brilliance.
Yeah.
And the idea is to split your forces into separate field armies, 3 or 4, and to retreat if you're attacked directly by Napoleon himself, to fall back, to remain in contact with him, not to, to retreat in good order. And for your other armies, which are going to be confronting possibly Napoleon's less capable marshals, for them to advance and to sort of gradually box Napoleon in until you have overwhelming superiority. And essentially this is the plan which is put into effect and that culminates and indeed succeeds brilliantly at the Battle of Leipzig.
And they don't come face to face with him until Leipzig, Chris.
Well, they do in some ways, because Berlin is defended by a series of battles. There are 4 of them, in fact. Grossbeeren is probably the first one, where one of Napoleon's thrusts, if you like, by one of his columns goes in. There are 3 others as well, at Kolm and also Catchback. It's not relevant where they are, but Dennewitz is really important because Marshal Ney is comprehensively defeated here. And so you're picking up quite a lot of momentum here in terms of actually defeating Napoleon's marshals in detail. Now, what happens is that the Austrians get involved, and Schwarzenberg fancies having a go at Napoleon himself. And essentially there's a battle at Dresden where the Austrians are thoroughly defeated by Napoleon himself. So they get the lesson pretty quickly that you shouldn't take him on. Now, what's critical here is that Napoleon decides to garrison Dresden with 2 of his generals, Saint-Cyr and Rowe. And the problem for that is he leaves 20,000 troops there as well. Now, Napoleon's real sort of way of operating is to mass every single person you can in battles. And what he's done is he's left 20,000 troops there. He's also got 80,000 other troops garrisoning some of these cities around. So he's short of 120,000 troops who actually are garrisoning at the moment, not available at Leipzig. And of course, he's taken losses in these 4 battles up until now.
Well, Michael, I kind of asked you before we started, actually, what is going on in Napoleon's head as well at the moment? You've got in 1805, he's got Austerlitz, one of his greatest victories. Is he at all thinking in the German campaign, I can easily win that?
Well, I suppose if you take a kind of long view of Napoleon's career, he's fought and won many battles decisively. And you go back to Marengo, I think, in sort of 1800, and Austerlitz, of course, famously. So whenever there is a political problem, a sort of cataclysmic battle, at least cataclysmic for the opponents, tends to be Napoleon's solution. So I think you can see how he is thinking along the same terms. 1813 is a very political campaign. And yes, I think Napoleon can be criticised for leaving, for example, a garrison in Dresden, which incidentally, that's the Saxon capital.
Yeah, is there a point when he realises things are going wrong?
I think, he has to keep an eye on his allies in the Confederation of Rhine, Saxony, Bavaria, Württemberg and the others. And if you abandon the capital of one of your allies and sort of hand it over, in effect, to your enemy, that's going to have real political repercussions. And of course, they're a bit like dominoes. If Saxony's going to defect, then, well, Bavaria and the others are going to
and it's
defect
interesting
as well.
that Bernadotte is working on the Saxons. He's actually fought with them before.
Okay.
And Napoleon probably knows that Bernadotte has got his agents working within the Saxon elements of Napoleon's army, and indeed politically as well. And as we'll see during the battle itself, 6,000 Saxons actually decide they don't want to play anymore and go over to the other side. So he knows this is going on. So Mike's point is incredibly well made. You've got to anchor yourself here. And we have to remember the Bavarians have already defected.
Yeah.
Württembergers, the Westphalians as well, the Prussians, if you like, have also gone. And so it's gradually falling apart. And you can see why he centres himself here in Saxony once he's failed to get to Berlin in the initial phases.
Well, of course, this all culminates at Leipzig, here on the map. Let's go there now and focus on the battlefield. Here we are then. Let's talk about the Battle of Leipzig itself. We've got a map in front of us showing the battlefield. We've already mentioned it's kind of, unprecedented in scale, over 500,000 men. And Chris, eventually Napoleon finds himself surrounded, but looking at this map, you can kind of see how that starts to happen.
Well, in fact, he's actually allowed himself to get surrounded. He thinks he can operate on internal lines. You've got this old fortified, decayed city of Leipzig in the middle. He can concentrate all his logistics. He's got all his firepower here. And what he's trying to do is say, I know I've got Blucher to the north. I've got Schwarzenberg to the south. I've already beaten Schwarzenberg, so I reckon in the second leg I can do it again.
Yeah.
So what he's planning to do is fix Blucher in the north here. And while he's fixing him here and keeping him occupied, he's going to do a 3-corps attack on Schwarzenberg with 2 other corps coming round to the right-hand side. And then he's going to bring in the Imperial Guard and the cavalry to smash through the centre with the artillery as well. That's his plan. So essentially hold off one and make sure before Bernadotte arrives from the northeast and further troops arrive under Benningsen, Russians mostly, arrive here on the right flank of Schwarzenberg. So essentially knock the Austrians out of the game and then turn and deal with the Prussians afterwards.
So that's his plan. We should say that Napoleon is kind of around here on the map and Blucher is up here. That's his plan, Michael. If we look at the first day, though, well, how does it play out?
Well, the key days was 16th of October. Nothing much happens on the 17th and the 18th.
Pretty much a stalemate, is it, on the second day?
Well, they're sort of both sides are sort of licking their wounds, and Napoleon even thinks about having some kind of truce, but the Allies are not interested. Why should they be? So the 16th is the key, and Chris is correct. The idea is to really punch through the Allied centre, and Schwarzenberg would be here. This is the bulk of the Austrians with some Russians as well. There's Murat's cavalry. Now, for this to be effective, you really need at least an additional corps. And the trouble is that they're fixed. You've got Marmont's corps here, which is engaging with Blucher, who's moved much faster than anyone had anticipated over the previous days. And you have Bertrand's corps here. And this is, of course, here, this area towards me is Napoleon's emergency exit. So you need to keep this kind of open. And that's being threatened by a corps under Goulet, an Austrian general. So these forces here, which Napoleon could have well used against Schwarzenberg, they're not available on the 16th.
And don't forget Saint-Cyr in Dresden as well. So there's another corps there. In fact, Napoleon's waiting for another corps to arrive. He's got about 17,000 other men on the march coming in. And if they arrive in time, he could have used them, but they don't arrive. That's the problem.
So that failure to break through, is it essentially kind of over on the first day?
I would say that's the high water mark. One thinks of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg.
Yes.
This is the high water mark, and it comes close. But the Allies, and actually I think Alexander I, who's over here with Schwarzenberg, deserves a little bit of credit for plugging various holes. They plug the holes rather like Wellington does at Waterloo, and they don't break through. But sort of counterfactual is he's got an extra corps, he breaks through. He takes out the Allied High Command because you've got Frederick William I, you've got Francis, and you've got Alexander. Two emperors and one king. That would have been an incredible bag.
I mean, bizarrely, it works. I mean, it's staggering when you consider what could go wrong here between allies. In fact, Alexander himself arrives on the first day and says, "I don't like the plan."
Yeah.
He says to Schwarzenberg, "We're not doing any of that," and everybody agrees that Schwarzenberg's plan was really bad because it involved a series of sectional attacks which basically would have sort of broken up the formation. And of course, Napoleon would have eaten that for breakfast. There's no question about that. And Alexander says simply, look, we've got overwhelming firepower. We've got other people on the way. We don't actually have to do anything.
No.
We just compress the battlefield, push it in. And this idea that Napoleon short of a corps is absolutely critical to the battle, because the whole plan depended on an additional corps being available to actually punch through.
And you mentioned it earlier as well, the lack of cavalry.
Yep.
Presumably here, that is where it becomes really important.
Yes, it is. But in fact, I mean, he has got substantial cavalry to actually put into this battle. What actually they failed to do is bring up their artillery in time to support the cavalry, because you need to blast away at infantry for the cavalry actually to capitalise on their success. And Rowe, his head of artillery, very early on says, look, I'm pretty committed up here at the moment, keeping Blucher at bay. Where are we going to put the artillery at this stage? And I think that's part of the problem in the south. Yeah.
I'm already sort of getting into counterfactual territory here, Michael, so forgive me. Say, that some of these forces do come down there and help break through. Do you then not have another problem that then Blucher just comes down here and you're stuck in a pincer?
I mean, Blucher has a fantastic campaign, especially actually in the weeks before the battle. He marches his army really across Saxony and more or less links up with the army of the north under Bernadotte. And in many ways actually compels Bernadotte to move the army of the north southwards. Bernadotte had been rather reluctant. So it's from Napoleon's perspective, on the 16th of October, that's too late. That part of the campaign, if you like, has been lost thanks to Blucher's brilliance.
There's an interesting echo at Waterloo. If you remember.
Already covered on the episode of History Undone.
Indeed, with us, yeah. But what's really interesting at Waterloo, Grouchy is detached to stay on Blucher's tail and to keep with him. And this is an echo from here, because they failed to actually notice Blucher coming in at this stage. And of course, as we'll see in subsequent days, there are other forces that come in which are not detected. So again, it's this lack of screening, the lack of surveillance that is causing a problem for Napoleon.
And perhaps I could add, as an interesting sort of footnote to this, is that Blucher's actually been disobeying orders.
Yes.
In early October, he's been told to link up actually with Schwarzenberg and the army of Bohemia, so linking up here. But he's sort of, in effect, disobeyed orders, and he's moved northwest, and that's a crucial decision in this campaign.
Interesting thing about Rowe, by the way, the artillery expert on Napoleon's side, he was actually at Trafalgar as well.
Oh.
So he's one of the few people to have served both at Trafalgar and Leipzig and also at Waterloo later. It's quite an extraordinary career.
Can we go to the 18th? Because, if this was a soap opera, the most exciting bit in my head is when the troops turn on Napoleon. How and sort of why does that happen?
Well, I mean, of course, you've got these allies who've been fighting for Napoleon, so Württemberg, Saxon troops. And they defect. I don't think, frankly, it makes a huge difference to the battlefield. The Bavarians have already defected about a week early, on the 8th of October. But it does show you that Napoleon's German empire is crumbling, and you're beginning to get the effects of German nationalism. Germans call this the Battle of the Nations, the Völkerschlacht, and it references that growing importance of national sentiment, which is beginning to affect troops, who are not going to follow their princes. They're going to start to follow a kind of a national allegiance.
Well, yeah. Is this as much of a diplomatic defeat as a military defeat?
Well, I think that they're interrelated. I mean, I think the key thing for the 18th, Fergus, is the fact that you get the arrival of two very large armies. You get Bernadotte, Charles John of Sweden, arriving with 75,000 men here, and you get another guy called Benningsen, who's working with the Austrians and the Russians. He brings in another 80,000. So you're bringing 150,000 troops here, and so you're between the vice already. You're now having it close. Now, my view, and I've discussed this with Mike already, is if he'd had early intelligence of that, you'd have made the decision to go earlier. Right. That's the point. So instead of going overnight 18th, 19th, you'd have gone overnight 17th, 18th. And so this lack of reconnaissance has really let Napoleon, for once, let him down. So the Allies have brought in a perfect entrapment here. There's no question. This is Stalingrad in 1813, if you think about it. And it's the arrival of these other massive armies and the failure, basically, of Reynier, one of his other generals, to bring in 27,000 people that really makes him say, look, I need to get out of here.
Are you in agreement with that?
Yes, I am. And I think it comes back to that issue of cavalry. I mean, what we've got here, essentially heavy cavalry, But what is really a problem is also the absence of light cavalry, or much of it. They're your sort of drones, if you like, of the Napoleonic period. You know, they're your eyes. You can see with them. And Napoleon is operating partly blind. And especially on the coalition side, of course, you've got Russian Cossacks. You know, the Russians are very good at light cavalry. They also strike
Some of
terror.
you are using bows and arrows in this battle, by the way.
1813.
Yeah, I know, that's amazing. I mean, there's an echo of Gettysburg here, where Lee fails, of course, to have the reconnaissance provided by Jeb Stuart, who's off on his own. And yet again, you are not seeing the dynamics of the battlefield, seeing what's going on. And Napoleon's used to what we call manoeuvre warfare. He doesn't do this set-piece stuff. He needs to provide surprise. To do that, he needs intelligence. Here, it's failed him.
So if we just end then with the blowing of the Ulster Bridge, again, it makes for a great story. I think you said 30,000 men sort of trapped, captured or dead. How crucial is it to actually the order of the battle?
Yeah, so the Ulster's the river here, and the bridge presumably is at this point here.
You mentioned his exit plan.
His exit strategy is here. It's the Gulai has been trying to sort of block that. Napoleon keeps the exit open, and he gets the bulk of his forces out, but about 30,000 are trapped on the wrong side of the bridge. So,
I mean, it's an interesting story because it's a very clear order. When the Prussians arrive, or whenever we get a situation down here, a colonel is told it's quite simple. If they arrive, then you blow the bridge. Now that means in main force. That's the point. Okay, but what happens is the whole blowing of the bridge is delegated down to a corporal who is told blow the bridge if you see any of the enemy approaching. Well, he sees skirmishers coming forward, not the main force. So as soon as he sees any of the opposition coming forward, he blows the bridge.
I mean, it seems like amateur stuff.
Well, no, remember, people are trying to get out of here. And but there's a court-martial afterwards of the colonel concerned, and he just about gets away with not being shot because, as we've said, it leaves behind a significant proportion of the French army, 30,000 of them, who either get killed or indeed have to surrender, which is a significant number of people. No doubt about it.
So we're going to bring this section to a close in just a second. Obviously, it's a big defeat for Napoleon, and the effects are pretty much instant overnight, right? The dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine.
It is amazing how quickly French power collapses in Germany after that. Napoleon retreats. He retreats towards the French Empire. The Bavarians, under Rede, a former ally, try and block his path at Hanau, but they're swept to one side. But yeah, all the Confederation of the Rhine states, they go over to the Allies. And that's actually very useful. The armies might individually not be brilliant, but it means that their troops can be incorporated into the coalition effort and used for sort of second line activities, sort of investing French fortresses which are left behind, guarding prisoners of war. So it means that the actual frontline strength of the Allied powers, of Austria, Prussia, of Russia, as they move forward, isn't diminished. So they keep that momentum going up, and they reach the Rhine by the end of the year.
A couple of other things need bearing in mind is that, as we've said, France was bled dry, really, in terms of resources and manpower, even before this campaign. Now, he loses nearly 500,000 troops in this campaign. So getting that back again is going to be very difficult. And that has its effect on the Waterloo campaign later, of course. Now, one other thing that we need to bring into perspective here, as he retreats, of course, the previous June, Wellington has won the Battle of Vittoria at the foot of the Pyrenees and basically is crossing the Pyrenees into France. So he's actually into a two-front war now. So he's not only got this problem with the Allies coming after him, he's now got southern France being invaded by the Spanish, the Portuguese, and Wellington coming through the Pyrenees. So it's a bigger strategic picture. Meanwhile, Royal Navy's happily blockading him and keeping the continental system under pressure.
And of course, Napoleon is then exiled to Elba, which potentially leads into the Battle of Waterloo. I won't go ahead too quickly because that, of course, is the real history of what happened at the Battle of Leipzig. Now let's do what we love doing on History Undone and undo it. This is History Undone. Okay, time to get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves those really long-term questions. Had Napoleon won the Battle of Leipzig? We're back with our sort of wide-scale map of Europe. Michael, I'm going to start with you. Often the first question we like to do in this section is, how could he have won the battle?
I think he could have won had Blücher not obeyed orders earlier October, and had he not sort of moved the army of Silesia to a position where it threatened the northern part of the battlefield, on the 16th, freeing up then forces which Napoleon, so I'm thinking of perhaps Marmont's corps in particular, could have used for that sort of attack, that breakthrough.
Yeah.
And Napoleon would have then, effected a breakthrough against the main line to the south of Leipzig under Schwarzenberg. I mean, the topography is vaguely in Napoleon's favour there. He's got the high ground. I think you could then envisage a Napoleonic victory, which might have turned actually quite spectacular if he'd, knocked out the Allied high command and sort of captured Alexander I of Russia in particular.
Do you need those movements to be in place, though, earlier in the campaign? We talked about the Allied plan and how well it worked.
I think it becomes difficult on the 16th. I think you need perhaps a day or two earlier for Blücher to be held up. And not to move as fast as he should. So it's less about Napoleon doing anything brilliant. It's more about Blücher not being as brilliant as he actually turns out to be.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think the campaign is flawed from Napoleon's point of view. I mean, you really shouldn't allow your army to be split so you're defeated in detail. So the 4 battles beforehand, I think, were unnecessary. And I think the other way he doesn't get defeated at Leipzig, he doesn't go there. To tell you the truth, it's not a great place to fight a battle if you're being surrounded by major allies.
Where else might you choose then?
Well, I think I'd have concentrated on Dresden. Oddly enough, it's much more defensible in some ways. Also, I would have taken the opportunity to smash the Austrians again early, because I think if you smash the Austrians, you can then turn on the others before they can concentrate on you. That would have been my preference. I've always found Leipzig an odd place to fight a battle where you're trying to fight it from the inside out. With all the obstructions you've got there, a lot of water features and things like that. He's not very strong in engineers at the time, not like he would. Of course, he's lost them all in Russia. So he's basically fighting a battle in the same way he's always fought it, expecting the same result with less resources. And as Mike indicated earlier, these are inexperienced troops. And I think one thing we chatted about earlier is they actually changed the way they fight just before the battle. So instead of actually the infantry being in 3 ranks, they're actually in 2 ranks. Now, partly that's to conceal you don't have enough troops. Yeah. And one thing we should emphasise the battle is that Napoleon's outnumbered by almost 2 to 1 here by the end of it. So that's a good time to go. But the very fact that he has to abandon Leipzig tells you it's probably the wrong place to be in the first place. And the fact that he's got an escape route is saying, this could go wrong for me. So, Mike, what do you think? Fight at Dresden or somewhere else, or even on the road to Berlin?
Because they're very close to one another, right?
Yes, but Dresden is further east. And, of course, you've got Schwarzenberg and the Austrians here. So, I mean,
That's why you smash them first.
Your line of if it goes wrong, it means that your lifeline, your emergency exit is slammed shut. And then it's... then it's over, isn't it?
That word hubris we use a lot in History Undone.
There is an element of hubris here. I think having smashed up Schwarzenberg at Dresden, he thinks he can do it again. But then he doesn't do that. He gets himself, and as you say, Mike, Blücher comes in inconveniently. If Blücher hadn't come in, he'd have had Schwarzenberg where he wanted him and pushed him back over the mountains again. That's where he wins. If he manages to take out the Austrians first and then turns around and says, well, OK, guys, who's next?
Yeah. OK, so let's talk about some of those impacts. I want to start with, before the break, we said that kind of overnight, the Confederation of the Rhine was dissolved pretty much immediately. In this scenario, is it the 6th Coalition which falls apart?
Yes. I mean, the Bavarians have defected before the Battle of Leipzig. And I suppose if it goes the other way, they'll probably be well advised to sort of reconsider their position. So I think it doesn't unravel. I think the Russian side is a bit fragile in the sense that there are a lot of Russians, Kutuzov, who's just dead by this stage, but there are other Russians as well, Tsar Alexander's brother Constantine, say this isn't really our war. You know, we will go back to Russia. This war is now being fought in the interests of others. And of course, if the Russians exit, you know, the coalition has fallen apart. I mean, the Prussians are very determined. They want revenge. They've really got their heart in this conflict. But I think neither the Russians do nor the Austrians, who after all have got that dynastic link with France. So they've got their, if you like, insurance policy, which is through dynasticism. So I think they would go back to 1809, or 1810, which is learning to live with a French empire, and perhaps seeing certain advantages of that. It does balance out Russia. So yeah, the French Empire would survive, and it would. What happens to the Duchy of Warsaw, I suppose we don't know. I mean, one weakness of Napoleon is, of course, that whenever he wins a battle, he tends to up his sort of demands, his sort of political, and he always tends to go a little bit further than can really be achieved. So he might not sort of say, OK, I've won, I'm going to kind of like retrench. You'd probably demand something else.
Would the French Empire survives? Does it survive with Napoleon? I mean, he only dies 9 years after this, 8 years after this.
Yeah, but it may have been the arsenic in the wallpaper in St Helena, of course, that killed him off. It might not have been natural causes. There is one issue we haven't considered, is you've actually got Wellington down here in the south. So even if he wins at Leipzig, what does Britain do at this stage? Does it continue with the invasion, trying to draw allies in? It's quite dangerous here. But I suspect, if you look at the campaign that Wellington wanted to do, he's going to march up the west coast here, supported by the fleet. And that's what he was going to do if he'd had to continue. So does that campaign continue if Napoleon comes back to France, mobilises France? I suspect Wellington would have gone back behind the Pyrenees at this point.
What do you think?
I think so. I think what he would have done had Napoleon not collapsed in Central Europe, so in our counterfactual, I think he would have possibly taken on Suchet in Catalonia. Yeah. He's the one sort of French marshal that actually does quite well in Spain.
Supported by the Navy as well.
So the Pyrenees would not have been breached. The question then, of course, what does Britain do at that point is interesting.
I mean, the other issue about it is the French have rebuilt 80 ships of the line by this stage. Yeah. And so you're going to build more based on the fact you're dominating this area again.
Yes.
You can take on the Royal Navy again at this point, and maybe a second Trafalgar beckons, and you put pressure on Britain at this stage. So in order to get rid of this threat here, reinstall your brother dominating the Iberian Peninsula, you then put pressure on Britain again. So we might have had a situation where he arrives at the Channel again with his army, and his fleet, a few years, not straight away, is starting to threaten Britain again.
And who wins that?
Well, there's so much in that.
Well, I think Britain is not going to be invaded, but I think what Britain doesn't do is send 15,000 troops to the United States in 1814.
Yeah.
So a Napoleonic win at Leipzig means that Washington, D.C. isn't burnt down. And it also means that the Battle of New Orleans doesn't happen. And,
Mobile Bay or anything.
Andrew Jackson doesn't build up his sort of political career. So I mean, it does have big impact, I think, in the Western Hemisphere.
So it's got impact far away from what we're seeing on this map.
Absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing in America is Andrew Jackson, of course, the hero of New Orleans, justified or not. And everybody forgets that New Orleans actually took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, so everybody was fighting for nothing. Whether his reputation would have propelled him to the presidency afterwards. We've discussed before that he had a successful campaign against the Seminole Indians and against residual Spanish sort of interests in the Americas, which might have done the same. But the other thing, of course, Michael, if you don't have New Orleans, you don't have the American national anthem.
Well, exactly. You don't have references to rockets.
That's right.
I didn't think we'd be hearing that today on History Undone.
And there's a good point. I mean, Michael brings up the point. There is a Captain Bogue, basically on the Allied side at Leipzig, who's there with Congreve rockets. And he gets killed, unfortunately, but he's there firing off his rockets. And what did Wellington say about rockets?
Wellington doesn't like rockets, and partly because they spook horses. But Wellington and our American audience don't like this. Says that rockets are effective only against savages and Americans. So he doesn't want them anywhere near his army in Spain.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting I think it is interesting across the Atlantic what happens here. The other thing, of course, is if Napoleon manages to restore the situation in Spain, what happens in South America subsequently?
Yeah.
Because if you restore the French fleet, you restore French prestige, Spain comes on side again. Spain is in a much more powerful position to bring in its French allies to say, we're not in the business of losing our possessions in South America at this stage. So the whole map of South America might look different if Leipzig had gone the other way.
You potentially like a new empire.
Possibly. I mean, there is a sinister twist in that Napoleon does talk about the shifting of the whole kind of archival collection, which was held by the Kingdom of Spain, dealing with South America to Paris. So he's obviously...
he's got his eyes on it.
He's thinking big. He's thinking big.
Yeah. So Leipzig may have done that. Mike, one thing that I'm sceptical about is how much more fighting power they can generate at this stage. We saw Waterloo, very difficult indeed, and indeed some of his former marshals say this is not going to work. France needs to recover at this stage very seriously.
Well, also, surely in this scenario, the pieces aren't there for Waterloo to happen.
No need.
No, I mean...
No. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Wellington stays in Spain at this point. You need him there to obviously keep the conquests under control and all that sort of thing. Britain is trying to say, well, what's our skin in this game? Is there going to be a seventh coalition? And that's the other thing. I believe had he won at Leipzig, give it a couple of years, another coalition would have occurred because they wanted to contain him. They wanted to do this. Meanwhile, Germany, I think, is going to be back in the 30 Years' War again, if that happens. If you have a seventh coalition, it's going to be quite anarchic in here, I suspect, as that settles down. The leader of that coalition, Russia, probably, Mike, do you think?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I mean,
or do they go back and isolate again?
I think if Napoleon wins Leipzig really decisively, I think Prussia might be sort of dismembered.
Yeah.
I think it might be sort of wiped off the map completely.
Interesting, because then we can move on to the First World War.
Well, the rise of Prussia doesn't happen.
That doesn't happen.
No?
Certainly not in the timescale. If you don't have Prussia as the engine of unification for Germany, none of that happens.
So you don't get a First World War, or
well, you don't get a Germany. That's the first thing.
No.
The Confederation of the Rhine appears in a new guise. If Napoleon continues to dominate this, there's no war against Denmark, no war against Austria, and no war against France. So the whole dynamic of the late 19th and 20th century just disappears in Europe.
Yeah.
So you're right. But at some stage, who's going to take on Napoleon and his heirs? That's the point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ironic, of course, that Germany is fighting against another Napoleon III, in 1870, 1871.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Prussia is nowhere. It's probably wiped off a map, and you'll have this weird sort of multinational entity. It's a bit like sort of Charlemagne's empire,
like Holy Roman Empire
under a Bonaparte, Habsburg dynastic kind of family. Now, can such an entity survive a rise of nationalism, which is got its own dynamic behind it? Are Germans, Italians going to kind of, throughout the 19th century, are they going to sort of put up being part of this huge sort of multinational entity, which Britain won't be part of, nor will Russia, but what can they do about it?
Final thought from you on that, Chris?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Germany just stays the disparate group of states that ever it was, from the Holy Roman Empire all the way through to unification. And instead of Poland, another state that won't appear here is Poland, of course, because you've got the Duchy of Warsaw, basically overshadowed by Russia. I think what you're setting up for here is a France v Russia contest for domination of Europe. So that's the dynamic and axis I think you're seeing. And I think Charlemagne's empire, in fact, Napoleon always talks about recreating Charlemagne's empire. So that's exactly what would happen. You keep Germany weak, you keep Austria offside. There's your problem, is what Russia wants to do, whether it wants to face west or face east. On the German side, the whole German nationalism thing, of course, is a dynamic that is unstoppable throughout the 19th century.
Yes.
Once it starts rolling. If you can't get it started, you're not going to see Germany emerging by 1870.
This is why I love History Undone. In this version we've just talked about, we are talking about no Waterloo, no First World War, no modern-day Germany, no US national anthem, which I didn't think I'd be saying today. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Dr. Michael Rowe for joining me. We will be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.